All right, hi Wheat North chemistry students. Mr. Holtgren here, and today we're going to talk about covalent bonds. Okay, now we're going to go through some characteristics of covalent bonds. Up at the top here, it talks about, the important concept you guys have to understand is that physical and chemical properties are going to differ in compounds with ionic versus covalent bonding, and that's something we discovered in our properties of compounds lab. The first thing with covalent bonds is why they occur is because the electronegativities are very similar to each other. They're very close. So that means that neither atom can steal an electron from the other. That's unlike ionic bonds where stealing does occur. So you see our example down here, we've got oxygen and fluorine, and both of those have very high electronegativities. Okay, so they're both in that mid to upper 3 range. And as a result, and we're trying to show through the picture here, that they can't steal that electron from each other. Okay, because those electronegativities or their strengths are so similar, so they can't steal from one another. Instead, what they do, which we're showing by the two girls here sharing so nicely that book, is that the electrons are being shared by those two atoms instead. Okay. Another thing to make sure you're clear on is that covalent bonds will happen between two nonmetals. Okay, so whereas ionic was between a metal and a nonmetal, the covalent bond is going to be between two nonmetals. And the reason that happens is that metals, because they have that 1, 2, 3 valence electrons, they want to get rid of those electrons, right? Now nonmetals, on the other hand, they're quote unquote takers, which you can see here, this dog and the little baby here trying to get at that food. So as a result, they're trying to steal or take those electrons, and because they're the same strength, though, they end up sharing instead. Okay, so covalent bonds, you've got two nonmetals. Ionic, you've got a metal and a nonmetal. Okay. Now, when these guys do share that electron or electrons, that bond is a shared electron cloud. Okay, so it's just that place you can see up the top here where they both are able to become more stable by gaining that extra electron or electrons in their electron clouds. But again, they're not strong enough to steal from each other, so they're just going to share that electron cloud space. Okay. Now here's some little kind of a side note with this. After bonding, all the compounds are neutral overall. Okay, because no ions are being formed in this, there's going to be lots of different combinations that can be made. Okay, whereas ionic, because there's charges involved, you end up with the formulas kind of being locked into place. Whereas with this, if you have nitrogen and oxygen, which are both nonmetals, because there's no charge, because they're not stealing or sharing or stealing electrons from each other. Since they're sharing, there's no charges involved, and as a result, you can have lots of different combinations. So you can see through the picture here, you can have one nitrogen, one oxygen, one nitrogen, two oxygens, two nitrogens, three oxygens. There's lots of different combinations. Again, because the compound overall is neutral and there's no charges associated with covalent bonds, because it's two nonmetals sharing their electrons, you can have lots of different combinations. Okay, and then the names you can see here tell us what the combo is. So these may be things you have heard of before. So for example, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, those are probably the two most common ones that you guys have heard about. All right, a little side note here. We have these things called diatomic molecules, and there are 7 of them, and it's kind of easy to remember this way, right? It starts at 7, see nitrogen here, atomic number 7, and it makes a 7, so it looks like a 7. You see those? But those are only 6. Hydrogen is also diatomic. Now, what diatomics are, these are elements that they are not stable by themselves, so they're going to covalently bond with themselves. So you have, instead of just finding hydrogen, you don't find just one atom of hydrogen floating around. They're always going to partner up with one of themselves to create H2, and the same is true for these other ones. So what you want to do is on your periodic table, make sure you box these or highlight them in some way so that you can remember whenever you see them, they're diatomic. Now, other gases like helium, neon, argon, they are not diatomic. The reason why is they don't need to be. Remember, they already have their full valence shell, so they don't need to share electrons with anyone. They're just totally satisfied and happy as can be by themselves. Okay? All right, now if we look at the big summary here on how to predict, right, if you've got something that's ionic or covalent. First question you need to ask yourself is, does the compound contain a metal and a nonmetal? If there's a metal in there, you know it's going to be ionic, right? Because then you have something that has a really low electronegativity, being the metal, and something with a high electronegativity, the nonmetal. And in that case, you're going to have the stealing taking place. Okay, now, does the compound contain a nonmetal and a nonmetal? Now, if this is the case, then you're going to have your covalent bond. Okay, so because they're both the same electronegativity about, you're going to end up with sharing of electrons instead. All right, so let's look at some practice here, okay, so we can get good at being able to identify which is which. What kind of bond is formed between these two atoms? You've got lithium and sulfur. All right, what you should have said is that is ionic, of course. How did you know? Lithium is a metal. It's as simple as that, you guys. So don't make this more complex than it has to be. Second one, phosphorus and sulfur. That one is covalent. Phosphorus is a nonmetal and sulfur is a nonmetal. And lastly, oxygen and sulfur. That one is covalent as well because we have oxygen and sulfur, which are both nonmetals. Okay, now that's the end of that. So where you should be right now is you should be able to tell the difference between what an ionic bond is, what a covalent bond is, how they're similar, how they're different. Okay, if you have any questions, please rewatch these videos or see your teacher for help.